Your textbook provides a great deal of information regarding pain pathways, but I also very much like this website from the University of British Columbia. You can find it at neuroanatomy.ca, and this is the pain module. So I'm going to step you through this module and just try and relate it to what you've seen in the lectures covered through your Neuroscience 6th edition textbook. The module from the University of British Columbia really covers the entire sequence that we're going through in module 3.1. And here are just the broad objectives of this particular module. I think this list of objectives actually just focuses on the concept of acute pain, which is sort of how we started in videos 3.1.1. So now through this sequence, we are going to move all the way from the periphery up to the cortex. And you can see here that the pathway we'll be following along for this acute pain will be the anterolateral system. This is named because it rises at the lateral side of the anterior portion of the spinal cord. Step one of this sequence is the sensation of a noxious stimulus. In this case, what you'll see is it's a pin or a tack. However, it could also be very hot, very cold temperatures. It could be chemical burns, something that you can think of that would cause pain. Step two is the activation of a nociceptor. So we can learn a little bit about these different types of sensory receptors. We have A delta fibers. These are going to be the fastest. They're going to detect first pain. Basically, it will tell you a little bit. It'll say, ow. C fibers, they're a little bit slower, and they're going to provide that secondary pain or diffuse pain. And they're going to be activated by a chemical reaction that's set off by the initial pinprick in this location. And then finally, the A beta fibers are actually just sort of generic sensory fibers. So they say that something has touched right here. And as will be discussed later, they're also involved in this gate theory of pain. So next up, we're going to follow these along because remember, these sensory receptors, these are the endings of sensory neurons, so those sensory afferents. And now we can look and see that all of them are basically coming into the spinal cord in the same bundle. So they're entering the spinal cord through what this website, for whatever reason, is calling the spinal ganglion or the posterior horn spinal cord. Your textbook and most other places are going to call it the dorsal horn and the dorsal root ganglion. So this thing hanging out the side, the left side of the spinal cord, you can see a cell body in the dorsal root, and it's extending processes both toward those sensory receptors and toward the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. And where that little red explosion is located now, that's actually a synapse. And that first order sensory neuron is synapsing onto a second order sensory neuron, which is then going to proceed to cross over to the other side of the spinal cord. And it looks like this one is rising up that anterolateral pathway. Remember that we have the A delta fibers as well as the C fibers that are transmitting pain signals. And the C fibers are thought to provide that more chronic pain feeling, the dull burn kind of pain. And that's because they're actually responding to chemicals that are produced in the region of a particular noxious stimulus. So in this case, stubbed your toe with a tack, and that's going to cause an inflammatory soup to appear in the region. So we have mast cells that are releasing all sorts of substances like this substance P, bradykinin, prostaglandins, histamine, all sorts of these inflammatory molecules that are causing the activation of the C fibers and leading to that throbbing pain. Now that we have taken those peripheral fibers and you've moved the first order through the first order neuron from the sensory receptor to that synapse in the dorsal horn, we can take a closer look at the dorsal horn where these synapses are being formed, so that first order synapse. And here are two types of pain fibers, A delta and C. The A delta fibers are going to send projections to this nociceptive specific set of cells, which you'll find in layers 1 and 2, or lamina 1 and 2 of the dorsal horn. And we then also have these things called wide dynamic range neurons down in lamina 5 of the dorsal horn. And they're really receiving inputs from all sorts of different sensory fibers. So not just pain, but also plain touch, vibration, all of that kind of stuff. C fibers a little bit different, but going to similar spots. You can see here that the C fiber is also going to these nociceptive specific cells in lamina 1, but they are creating synapses with interneurons in layer 2 and seem to have a greater input than the A delta fibers to these lamina 5 wide dynamic range neurons. The next step is to look at the responses of the neurons in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord and look at just sort of a feedback loop that gets created sometimes when pain signals are sent into the dorsal horn. So we start with those synaptic targets. So those were those typically lamina 1, 2, and 5 neurons. And there we go. We've got those synaptic targets. They're being targeted by the A delta and the C fibers, and mainly this is involving glutamate as a neurotransmitter, although substance P and this CGRP are also serving sometimes as neurotransmitters. So those are the targets. Then we have this thing happening called a wind-up, and the wind-up is basically an amplification process in which you've sense that initial painful stimulus that ends up creating that inflammatory soup in the region of the noxious stimulus, which creates an increased frequency of C fiber discharge. Remember, they're responding to the things like, the prostaglandins and the substance P. And that leads to increased firing of those wide dynamic range neurons in lamina 5. And so in this way, you are basically amplifying the signal that you would have seen from the initial pain response. So that's leading then to additional release of substance P, additional excitation of those neurons in the lamina of the dorsal horn, which leads to a sensitization of this whole system, which is then feeding back and leading to increased stimulation of the synaptic targets. So in this particular circumstance, what you're seeing is the pain basically amplifying itself, sending more and more signal the longer that noxious stimulus remains. So next step, we're going to move into the we're going to start following signals moving through the central nervous system. I realize we're already there, but the next step is going to be for those nociceptive specific and wide dynamic range neurons to now send signals across the spinal cord at this point called the anterior white commissure. And you can see it's at the anterior part of the medial anterior part of the spinal cord. It then sends those nerves off to this anterolateral portion, and that's where those nerves rise up. So this is the axon of this particular neuron. So it's rising up from this level in the spinal cord. So wherever the dorsal root ganglion entered in, it crosses over and then it starts its rise through the spinal cord at that point. At each layer of the spinal cord above where you have detected this crossover, you're going to see this set of axons in this same spot, this anterolateral spot. And the anterolateral pathway targets actually quite a few different regions of the brain. We have the spinothalamic tract. So that's, again, the spinothalamic tract is one tract of nerves within the anterolateral system. It basically goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Spinal hypothalamic tract from the spinal cord to the hypothalamus. Spinal mesencephalic from the spinal cord to this, you'll see the regions that are included in this mesencephalic region. And then finally, the spinal reticular. Again, we'll get into the actual regions. All right, so let's take a look at these different tracts within the anterolateral system. Notice they're all originating from that level of the spinal cord at which the dorsal root sensory neuron entered the spinal cord, and then they rise from there until they get to different portions of the central nervous system. So I'm just going to start from the bottom with this brainstem reticular formation, and if I click here, you'll see the signal traveling to these regions of the brainstem called the locus ceruleus and the raphe nuclei. As we'll get into in a moment, this reticular formation, or the spinal reticular tract, is going to play a big role in the modulation of pain. All right, so next, let's move to this spinal mesencephalic tract. And in this case, the important region here is going to be called this thing called the periaqueductal gray. And this is, again, a vital region for the modulation of pain. And as you'll see, I'll mention in the lectures, this is where a lot of the endogenous opioid release is occurring. So it's basically your natural response to pain. It helps to dull pain. Moving to the spinal hypothalamic tract, there you go. Moving up to the hypothalamus, that signal. And this is actually going to help to direct sort of the visceral response to pain. So if you have some sort of pain, you might increase your heart rate. It looks like there's a typo here. It might create some nausea. It might actually change your temperature. So maybe they were thinking about heat as well as heart rate. But these will be your visceral responses to pain. And then finally, the spinal thalamic tract. This is going to be for the more conscious stuff. So you can see that from the thalamus, the signals are continuing through another set. So these third order neurons. And they're continuing now to different parts of the cortex. And in the cortex, you're going to have the higher level, say, conscious experience, more of a response to the pain that allows you to decide what to do about it on a conscious level. I really like this illustration because I think it does a nice job, as I'll show you in a moment, of breaking down pain into different aspects. So we have this thing called the lateral pain system, and that's really sort of it says it right here actually, the pain in the finger. So it says something painful just happened, here's where the painful stimulus is located. That's what a lot of us think of as pain. However, there's this whole other medial pain system that is dealing with the suffering. So basically you've said there's something painful, here's where it is. This is the part that says ouch, and it basically says how much ouch. So was this just a minor inconvenience, or is this something that we need to deal with immediately? So we can also think of this as sort of the emotional part of pain. So now we're going to look at pain modulation, and they've split this into three major mechanisms for modulation of pain. These include the gate control theory, descending pathways, and that endogenous opioid system. And we're going to go through these one by one. So let's start with the gate theory. If I click this little guy, you'll see he's going to rub on what looks like a zit, but apparently that's something that is painful right now. When that portion of the skin has been rubbed, that activates these sensory A-beta receptors, which now send signals into the spinal cord through that dorsal ganglia. Step 2 of this, there's the signal entering there, and the C fibers are apparently still sending signals constantly. Let's do that again. So here's the signal moving through that C fiber, and they're just constantly signaling. Finally, step 4, the interneuron that was activated by those A-beta fibers. So that initial step 1, I'll show you that again. Step 1, the A-beta fiber is activated and it sends a signal into the spinal cord. It's this gray thing that we're most interested in now. So this is an interneuron, and it was activated by that A beta fiber. And it turns out that it was GABAergic, so it now releases GABA onto that wide dynamic range neuron and makes it less excitable. So it shuts it off so that that C fiber can no longer send pain signals up into the central nervous system. Note that this is called the gate theory because it's thought that there is a gate at this second order level for the C fibers, and the stimulation of the A beta sensory fibers shuts the gate by activating these inhibitory interneurons. Now we're going to move from the gate control theory, and I'll describe these descending pathways using their illustrations. So we'll move from top to bottom this time. So there are at least four descending pathways that are modulating pain. And the first would be this thing called the cortical pain matrix. And as the name suggests, this is descending pathways from the cortex. And this would be related to the conscious perception of pain. And things that are now these descending pathways are going to help to regulate your response to that pain. So now the periaqueductal gray, I mentioned this before and we'll hear about it again. It's also sending these descending fibers. It's called the periaqueductal gray because it's a region that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, which is basically this open space that connects the third and fourth ventricles within the brain. And the periaqueductal gray is just all of the region that surrounds that aqueduct. The locus ceruleus, this is noradrenergic, so it contains norepinephrine neurons. And these are, again, descending and helping to modulate that incoming pain signal. And they can actually have opposite effects. So depending on the situation, they can inhibit or they can actually excite that incoming signal. And then finally, the raphe nuclei, these are serotonergic, so serotonin-containing neurons. And they're going to release serotonin throughout the brain. And hopefully this can help to regulate the response, including through release of these enkephalons, which are sort of endogenous opioids. Now let's look at how they've divided this up, the third and final mechanism for pain modulation, and that's this endogenous opioid system. I've already mentioned to you that there's a lot of endogenous opioid signaling coming from this descending pathway from the periaqueductal gray. They've mentioned some other areas that might also contribute to this. But we're now going to be focused at the terminals, the termini of these descending pathways. All right, so here's the endogenous opioid system. What we're looking at here, we would be looking at a presynaptic neuron. This is going to look very familiar to you from Unit 2, where we have basically action potentials coming along that causes the opening of calcium channels, the influx of calcium. Potassium channels down there have to be closed, preventing any sort of hyperpolarization. And all of this is going to make for a more excitable presynaptic neuron. Now we can look at what happens when the opioids come along. So that was that G protein coupled receptor that they were showing in the previous slide, and I'll just show you that one more time. So this G protein coupled receptor is the opioid receptor. And when it binds to opioids, the first thing that's going to do is it's going to reduce the opening of those calcium channels. So now the action potential comes along and fewer calcium channels are going to open, meaning, as you know already, that fewer fusion events with these presynaptic vesicles are going to happen and less neurotransmitter release is going to happen. So less calcium means less glutamate released. Less glutamate released means less activation of the postsynaptic glutamate receptors, such as the AMPA and NMDA receptors. And this means a reduced response of that postsynaptic cell. Additionally, those opioid receptors are also increasing the activation of these particular opioid-induced potassium channels. And so in this case, the opioid receptor is responding, sending those G proteins over to activate the potassium channels. And now this current is causing hyperpolarization of the postsynaptic cell, probably the presynaptic cell as well, but the postsynaptic cell in this illustration, and that makes that postsynaptic neuron even less excitable, which is what is said here. So here is a summary of that in words, and adds a little bit of detail about particular enzymes that are involved, such as adenylyl cyclase, phospholipase C, things like that that are involved in the signaling between those opioid receptors and their targets, such as the calcium and potassium channels. So this is just a summary of this particular pain module, again, looking at acute pain. So this definitely gets a little more complicated when we start looking at chronic pain. In this case, we went from the periphery into the central nervous system. First started with those ascending pathways from the spinal cord all the way up into different regions of the brainstem, midbrain, and cortex. And then we looked at the descending modulatory pathways of pain. And these, again, were coming from those same locations and regulating pain via different pathways. So this is important, basically, as it says here at the bottom, because it's critical for survival. You need to be able to sense pain and respond to it quickly so that that noxious stimulus doesn't destroy more of your body than it needs to.